Welcome back, history lovers. Tonight, we're going to ask a question that sounds at first completely absurd. Why did medieval people have less anxiety than you? Before we begin, take a moment. If you enjoy these late-night journeys through history, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want to. And let me know down in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see how many corners of the world are quietly awake together. Now dim the lights. Fluff the pillow. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's story. Imagine waking up in a small English village somewhere in the middle of the 13th century. You don't wake because a device on your bedside table decided it was time. You wake because the light has changed, because the church bell has begun its slow, familiar toll before sunrise, and because a rooster somewhere nearby has started shouting at absolutely nothing with tremendous conviction. Your feet find a floor of packed earth strewn with rushes. The air inside the cottage smells of wood smoke and damp wool and last night's pottage. Somewhere beyond the thin wall, your neighbour's cow has once again wandered into the wrong field. An event which has occurred roughly every week for as long as anyone can remember, and which somehow surprises everyone every single time. And here is the strange part. Before you have opened both eyes, you already know how your entire day is going to go. Not roughly, not approximately, you know. You will eat something simple and unremarkable. You will walk toward the same fields you have walked toward since you were tall enough to carry a bucket. You will work until the light begins to fade. You will eat again, sit by a fire, and sleep. Tomorrow will be very much the same. So will the day after. So, most likely, will the next 20 years. Exciting? Not especially. Predictable? Absolutely. And it is precisely there, in that unglamorous predictability, that something remarkable happens to the human mind. Now, before we go any further, let's be careful with our words tonight, because stress and anxiety are not quite the same creature. Stress is what your body does when something is happening. A wolf appears, a storm gathers, a wagon wheel snaps on a hill. Your heart rate climbs, your muscles tense, and your body prepares to deal with the thing in front of you. It is unpleasant, but it is honest. It has a beginning and an end. Anxiety is different. Anxiety is what your mind does when nothing is happening yet. It is the fear of the thing that has not arrived. It is your brain running simulations of futures that may never occur over and over at 3 a.m. in high definition with excellent sound design. Medieval people had enormous amounts of stress, genuinely terrifying amounts. We will get to that, and I promise you will not finish tonight's video wishing you had been born in 1247. But anxiety, that particular modern ache, that low electrical hum of unease that follows you from room to room with no clear cause and no clear ending, that they had considerably less of. And the reasons why turn out to be surprisingly relevant to whatever is keeping you awake tonight. Let's start with the size of your world. As a medieval villager, your world is astonishingly small. There is the village. There are the fields around it, which you know the way you know your own hands. This corner floods, that corner grows stones overnight. This hedge belongs to a family who have been arguing about it since before your grandfather was born. There is the wood, which is useful and slightly frightening. There are 2 or 3 neighbouring villages, close enough to walk to, distant enough to be mildly suspicious of. There is a market town perhaps a day's journey away, which you might visit a handful of times in your life, and which you will describe afterward as very large and very loud. And beyond that? Well, somewhere out there is London. Probably, you've heard things. Most people in medieval Europe never travelled more than a few miles from where they were born. Unless you became a soldier, a merchant, a pilgrim, or made the truly spectacular decision to irritate the local lord, there was simply no reason to leave. Everything you needed and everyone you loved was within walking distance. At first that sounds suffocating, but think about what came with it. You were never comparing your life to thousands of strangers. Not once. Not accidentally. Not at 11 o'clock at night while lying in the dark. You did not lie awake wondering why a blacksmith in Flanders had somehow acquired his third horse while you were still negotiating daily with the same stubborn mule. You did not scroll through images of other people's harvests and conclude that everyone's barley was doing better than yours. You did not see a stranger's beautifully arranged supper and quietly feel that your own bowl of pottage was somehow a personal failure. You had absolutely no idea what anyone in Tuscany was doing. None whatsoever, and honestly, that alone might have taken 20 points off your blood pressure. Your comparisons stayed local, and more importantly, they stayed complete. You knew the baker, you knew the miller, you knew the carpenter and the priest, and the family whose pigs had escaped 3 times this month, with an enthusiasm bordering on ambition. When the blacksmith built himself a larger house, you didn't spiral. You knew exactly why he had a larger house. You had watched him work himself half to pieces for 11 years. You had seen him limping in November. Everyone agreed he'd earned it, and that was the end of the matter. That is the thing we've quietly lost. Not just the comparing, the context. Medieval envy came with the whole story attached. You knew the wealthy farmer had 6 children who ate like a besieging army. You knew the miller's roof leaked whenever the wind came from the west. You knew the blacksmith's shoulder had never really healed. Reality was always right there, balancing the picture, refusing to let anyone become a legend. Today your brain processes more human beings before breakfast than a medieval villager encountered in a decade. Faces, opinions, achievements, disasters, advertisements, breaking news, strangers who are furious about something, strangers who are thriving, strangers who apparently wake at 4 in the morning to drink something green and meditate on a mountain before answering correspondence. And every single one of them arrives pre-edited, showing you the finished cathedral and never the scaffolding. Meanwhile, you are standing in your kitchen trying to remember why you walked into your kitchen. Your brain never evolved for this. For almost the entirety of human existence, you lived among perhaps 100 or 200 people. Those were the faces your mind was built to recognize, to trust, to gossip about, to occasionally quarrel with, and then to see again at church on Sunday, while both of you pretended nothing had happened. Your social world had edges. It ended somewhere. You could reach the bottom of it. A modern mind never reaches the bottom of anything. There is always more. There is always another opinion you haven't heard, another crisis you haven't accounted for, another version of your life you could theoretically be living if you had made different choices at 23. Your attention is asked to stretch across the entire planet, and attention, like any material, gets thin when you stretch it. Of course, medieval villagers worried. Let's not romanticize. They worried constantly. They worried about the harvest. They worried about a child with a fever, about a winter that was arriving early, about taxes, about tithes, about whether the cow was going to produce milk this morning, or simply kick them again out of principle. Life could be genuinely, brutally hard, and there was very little cushioning between a person and their misfortunes. But look closely at the nature of those worries. Almost all of them were immediate. Almost all of them were tangible. You could see them. You could touch them. You could, quite often, do something about them. The roof is leaking. Fix the roof. The fence is broken, and the sheep have opinions. Mend the fence. The rain has not come. Pray. Wait. Watch the sky. There is a limit to what worry can accomplish, and medieval life made that limit extremely obvious extremely quickly. You were not lying awake at night thinking about interest rates on another continent. You were not tense about an argument between 2 strangers who will never know you exist. You were not staring at a ceiling composing a reply to a message marked urgent that arrived at 9:38 on a Friday evening from someone who will not read it until Monday. Your mental world was as small as your physical one, and there is enormous relief hidden in that, because here is what modern psychology keeps confirming. decade after decade, study after study, the human mind copes remarkably well with difficulty and remarkably badly with uncertainty. We can endure astonishing hardship if we understand it. What corrodes us is not knowing, the open question, the unresolved thread, the future that refuses to hold still long enough to be looked at. A medieval villager knew what tomorrow held, not perfectly, not safely, but structurally. They knew the shape of it. They knew the names of everyone who would be in it. They knew what would be asked of them and what they would eat at the end of it. It may not have been glamorous, it was frequently exhausting, but it gave the mind something our world almost never offers anymore: permission to stop scanning the horizon for the next thing to worry about. And that permission, it turns out, is one of the most valuable things a human being can be given. Now, if you had wanted to know what tomorrow looked like in a medieval village, you wouldn't have needed a calendar or a planner or 3 separate notifications politely informing you that you were already behind schedule. You wouldn't have needed to plan anything at all. You would simply have looked out the window. And that, the extraordinary, underrated psychological power of a life organised by the sky rather than by a schedule, is where we're going next. If it was spring, you planted. If it was summer, you tended what you had planted and prayed quietly about the weather. If it was autumn, you harvested, and you did so with an intensity that modern office life has no equivalent for. And if it was winter, you repaired tools, mended clothing, chopped wood, sat close to the fire, and tried very hard not to complain aloud about how cold your toes had become, because everyone else's toes were also cold and nobody wanted to hear it. Every season arrived carrying its own instructions. You did not have to decide what mattered most this month. The month told you. That rhythm mattered far more than most people realise, and modern psychology has spent decades slowly arriving at the same conclusion. Routine reduces anxiety. Not because routine is pleasant, it often isn't, but because a predictable future costs your brain far less energy than an uncertain one. When your mind already knows what comes next, it stops running simulations, it stops rehearsing, it settles. Medieval people did not invent this principle. They did not discover it, write papers about it, or sell it back to one another in the form of a productivity system. It was simply the structure of being alive. The sun decided when your workday began. The church bell announced the hours that mattered, not because anyone was checking a clock, but because sound travels well across fields and everyone in earshot received the same information at the same moment. The changing seasons dictated your priorities. Nature, rather than an inbox, was your manager. And nature, whatever else you might say about it, has never once sent you a message at 9:30 on a Friday night. You did not wake up asking yourself whether today might be the day to reinvent your career. You already had one. It had been decided some years ago, possibly before you could walk, and while that arrangement had genuine disadvantages we will discuss at length, it also meant that the enormous, exhausting question of what am I supposed to be doing with my life was simply not on the table. The table was full. There was work on it. You did not spend 45 minutes deciding whether to answer letters before breakfast or reflect quietly first. You probably spent 45 minutes attempting to persuade a donkey that a shallow stream was not, in fact, the single greatest threat ever to face humanity. The donkey remained unconvinced. The donkey is always unconvinced. And every village moved almost like a single organism. This is one of the details that gets lost when we imagine the past. We picture individuals, a farmer here, a baker there, going about separate lives. But a medieval village didn't work like that. When dawn arrived, everyone became busy at roughly the same time, because the light arrived for everyone simultaneously. When evening came, life slowed everywhere at once. Smoke began rising from chimneys within the same half hour. Families gathered indoors. Candles burned sparingly, because wax and tallow cost money, and darkness politely suggested that perhaps enough had been accomplished for one day. Imagine that for a moment. The setting sun actually meant that nobody could reach you anymore. Granted, your superior might have been a feudal lord rather than a regional manager, which carried its own considerable disadvantages, including the occasional requirement to fight people. But whatever else he was, he could not schedule an emergency meeting after supper. The technology simply did not exist. The darkness was on your side. There is something worth sitting with there. We tend to assume our ancestors lacked freedoms that we possess, and in most respects that is entirely true. But they possessed one freedom we have quietly surrendered without ever voting on it: the freedom of being genuinely unreachable. When the light went, the day closed, not because anyone had set a boundary, or negotiated one, or felt guilty about one, because the physics of the world closed it for them. Routine also removed a staggering number of small decisions, and small decisions are more expensive than we like to admit. Today you decide what to wear from a wardrobe overflowing with options, most of which you don't wear, several of which you don't like, and at least one of which you bought during a period of optimism about who you were becoming. Medieval clothing was considerably simpler. You owned work clothes. You owned better clothes for church, weddings, and feast days, and that was more or less the entire fashion crisis. There was no standing before a mirror whispering, "I have nothing to wear," while surrounded by enough fabric to outfit half the village. There was no mirror, for a start. There was a shirt, and it was on the peg, and the peg was where the shirt lived. Meals followed the same pattern. Breakfast, if taken at all, was modest. Bread, perhaps ale, perhaps nothing. Midday brought the main meal for most labourers, because that was when a body doing hard physical work most needed refuelling. Supper came before darkness settled in. Seasonal foods appeared when nature permitted them, and not one moment sooner. Strawberries did not arrive in January, because strawberries had not yet learned to cross continents. There was comfort in these repetitions. Not excitement, comfort, and those are two very different nutrients, both of which the human mind requires, and only one of which the modern world serves in abundance. Now this is the point in the evening where I have to be honest with you, because a story is only worth listening to if it tells the truth. Routine did not eliminate hardship, not remotely. Harvest season could be brutal. Every capable body in the village worked from first light until it was genuinely too dark to see, for days on end, racing the weather, because grain left standing too long could be destroyed in an afternoon. Winter could feel endless, particularly the last stretch of it, the hungry gap between the emptying of the stores and the first crops of spring, a season historians sometimes describe with the grim and accurate phrase, the hungry months. Storms could undo half a year of work overnight. Illness arrived without warning and left without explanation, but, and this is the important part, even those difficulties fit inside a familiar shape. They were not novel. They were not unprecedented. Your parents had endured them. So had their parents. Every generation before you had faced the same enemies in the same order, and the village carried a kind of inherited memory of how to survive them. You were not navigating an entirely new problem every week. You inherited rhythms that people already understood. They knew when to sow. They knew when to reap. They knew when to celebrate and when to simply endure. There was a body of accumulated wisdom sitting in the heads of the older people around you, and it applied directly and usefully to your actual life. Contrast that with our situation. Much of what causes modern anxiety is genuinely new. Nobody's grandmother has useful advice about the specific texture of being reachable at all hours by everyone you have ever met. The wisdom of previous generations applies less and less cleanly, which means each of us is improvising a life that nobody has quite lived before. That is thrilling. It is also lonely, and lonely is one of the main ingredients in anxiety. Life still surprised a medieval villager from time to time, but far less often than a modern person is surprised before finishing their first cup of coffee. Let's talk now about a question medieval people almost never asked themselves. Am I doing enough with my life? Today, that question hangs over nearly everyone. You are expected to discover your passion, then build a career around it, then maintain a healthy balance between that career and everything else. Then develop several interesting hobbies, stay physically fit, learn another language, invest sensibly for a retirement that is decades away and possibly theoretical, travel widely, maintain rich friendships, and become the best possible version of yourself before some invisible deadline that everyone feels but nobody set. No pressure at all. In the Middle Ages, life came with a much shorter instruction manual. If your father was a farmer, there was an excellent chance you would become one. If your mother spun wool, brewed ale, or baked bread, you would probably learn those same skills from the age of 6 or 7, not as a career decision, but as an inevitability, the way you learned to speak. If your family worked at the village mill, you likely knew exactly where you would be working long before your 10th birthday. Your future was not hidden behind a fog of endless possibility. It was standing directly in front of you, holding a tool, waiting for you to be tall enough. That sounds restrictive, because honestly, it was. Let's not soften it. Social mobility existed, but it was rare and usually required unusual circumstances. A talented apprentice could become a respected craftsman with real standing. A clever boy noticed by a priest might enter the church and receive an education, which was for centuries the single most reliable ladder in Europe. A fortunate merchant could accumulate genuine wealth. But for the vast majority, life ran along tracks that had been laid down generations earlier. Modern readers usually focus on what medieval people lacked. Freedom, opportunity, choice. Those are entirely fair observations, and I am not going to argue with any of them. But fewer choices also meant dramatically fewer identity crises. You did not spend 3 years quietly wondering whether farming truly reflected your authentic self. You were far too busy preventing the chickens from eating next year's seed. You did not experience the peculiar modern sensation of feeling vaguely guilty about a life you were not living. There was no parallel version of you doing something more interesting somewhere else, because there was no somewhere else that you could realistically have gone. And your community knew exactly who you were. That is worth pausing on. You were not expected to construct a personal brand. You did not need a carefully worded description of your values and objectives. Nobody asked where you saw yourself in 5 years. If someone had asked, the honest answer would probably have been hopefully still alive, and ideally still in possession of both cows, which was considered an ambitious yet realistic plan. Your identity came from relationships rather than achievements. You were someone's son or daughter, someone's wife or husband, someone's apprentice, someone's neighbour. Everyone knew your family, your reputation, your particular talents and your particular failings, and they knew where you belonged in the fabric of the place. That could absolutely feel limiting. If your reputation was poor, you did not get to move to a new city and start over. There was no fresh start. Your mistakes lived in the collective memory of 200 people, some of whom would bring them up at your funeral. But it also provided something that enormous numbers of people today are quietly starving for. Certainty. You belonged somewhere. There was a place in the world with a person-shaped space in it, and you were the person, and everyone agreed on this, and nobody was going to ask you to justify it. Modern society celebrates constant reinvention, new career, new city, new goals, new image. New version of yourself, refreshed every few years like a subscription. It can be exhilarating. It can also be exhausting, particularly for people who never wanted to be reinvented in the first place and would have been perfectly content being reliably themselves. The medieval world valued consistency far more than novelty. Becoming dependable earned greater respect than becoming remarkable. A trustworthy carpenter, an honest baker, a shepherd who genuinely knew his animals. These people contributed enormously to village life, and everyone knew it and said so. Of course, this system had serious costs. If you dreamed of becoming something entirely different, society could make that essentially impossible, and many people lived and died without ever escaping the circumstances of their birth. That is not a small footnote. That is a real tragedy repeated across millions of lives. So no, medieval life was not a paradise, and we are not going to pretend it was. But while a modern person can spend decades asking who they ought to become, a medieval villager usually woke up already knowing precisely who they were. And certainty, even imperfect certainty, even certainty you didn't choose, is remarkably calming for the human mind. Which brings us to something that sounds like a nightmare to modern ears, but which functioned as one of the most powerful anxiety treatments ever devised: the fact that in a medieval village absolutely everybody knew absolutely everything about you. If you had a bad day in the Middle Ages, there was a very good chance that everyone in the village knew about it before sunset. Today that sounds like a nightmare. Back then, it was often your safety net. Modern life celebrates independence. And independence is genuinely wonderful, right up until the moment something goes wrong. You are expected to solve your own problems, build your own career, manage your own finances, look after your own mental health, arrange your own care when you are ill, and, if at all possible, assemble your own furniture using instructions that appear to have been translated from ancient Latin by somebody who had never actually seen a chair. Medieval life worked differently, and the difference was fundamental rather than cosmetic. You were rarely alone. Almost never, in fact. Villages were small, some contained only a few dozen households, while larger ones might hold a couple of hundred people. You saw the same faces every single day of your life, and they saw yours. The baker was not a stranger behind a counter. The blacksmith was not simply someone who fixed your tools. The priest had almost certainly baptized you, and probably your parents, and quite possibly half your cousins, and he would eventually bury you too. Everyone knew everyone. Which meant, inevitably, that everyone knew everyone's business. Privacy was, let's be generous, and call it limited. If you argued with your husband, your neighbour heard it, because the walls were made of whatever had been available, and sound travels beautifully through wattle and daub. If your goat escaped and ate someone's cabbages, the entire village knew before midday, and would continue to reference the incident for approximately 11 years. If you tripped into a muddy ditch on the way home from the alehouse, congratulations, you had just become next week's entertainment, and possibly a minor local legend. Embarrassing? Constantly lonely? Almost never. Because here is the trade that was being made, whether anyone thought about it consciously or not. You surrendered privacy, and in exchange you received something extraordinarily valuable. You received witnesses. People who noticed. People who would observe that you had not been seen for 2 days and would come and knock on your door about it. When disaster struck, the community stepped in, because survival genuinely depended on cooperation. If your house caught fire, and thatch caught fire with enthusiasm, neighbours formed bucket lines within minutes, not because they were saints, but because the wind was blowing and their houses were next. If you fell ill during harvest, relatives and nearby families frequently brought in your crops, because a family that lost its harvest became a family that needed feeding all winter. And that cost everyone. If someone died, the village gathered, not only for the funeral, but for the far longer and more practical business of supporting whoever had been left behind. Helping was kindness, certainly, but it was also insurance, and everybody understood this perfectly clearly. One summer you might be helping your neighbour repair his roof. The following winter he might be helping you drag your wagon out of the mud after your horse had suddenly and dramatically forgotten how legs functioned. This constant, low-level, mutual obligation created something that psychologists now identify as one of the single strongest protections against chronic anxiety. Social connection, not the pleasant idea of social connection. The actual, physical, inconvenient, involves standing in the rain for someone else kind. Human beings evolved in tribes. We did not evolve for apartment buildings where you can live beside someone for 5 years and know them only as the person who occasionally vacuums at genuinely puzzling hours. Our nervous systems were calibrated for a world in which help was nearby and reliable, and they still expect that world, and they become quietly agitated when it is not there. Medieval people could not easily disappear into isolation. Sometimes they almost certainly wished they could. Picture trying to avoid an awkward conversation when every path through the village passes directly by people who have known you since the day you were born. There was no keeping a low profile. Old Margaret would simply appear at your door and ask why she had not seen you at church, and she would wait for an answer, and "I've been busy" was not going to survive contact with old Margaret. But consider what that meant in practice. In a medieval village, it was structurally very difficult to suffer silently for a long period without anyone noticing. The architecture of daily life made you visible. Your absence registered. Your changed behaviour registered. Somebody would remark on it, probably tactlessly, probably at an inconvenient moment, and probably before things had gone too far. That is not a small thing. That may in fact be one of the most significant differences between their emotional world and ours. Now, let's not descend into fantasy. Village life was not one endless festival of friendship and shared soup. People argued. Continuously they argued over boundaries, over grazing rights, over inheritance, over marriages, over who owed what to whom, over the precise number of days that a borrowed cart had been borrowed for. Manorial court records, the wonderful, petty, gloriously human documents that survive from these centuries, are absolutely stuffed with disputes about pigs. Somebody's pigs are always somewhere they shouldn't be. Somebody's pigs have destroyed somebody else's vegetables, again, and the entire community is going to hear about it in formal legal session. Grudges lasted decades. They were inherited occasionally, like furniture. Gossip spread faster than a horse at full gallop, and unlike a modern rumour, there was no convenient way to mute the conversation, block the participant, or simply leave. You would see that person on Sunday, and the Sunday after, and every Sunday for the rest of your natural life. Reputation in that world was not a nice thing to have, it was closer to a currency. A person known to be dishonest found that people would not lend to them, would not trade with them on favourable terms, would not help them in a bad year. Social punishment was real, and it had teeth. That pressure kept people in line, and it also kept people awake at night in ways we would recognise. So this was not utopia. It was something more interesting than utopia. It was a system with genuine costs and genuine benefits, and the benefit was this: underneath all the arguments, all the gossip, all the interminable business with the pigs, you belonged. Whether you liked every member of your community or not was almost beside the point. You were woven into it. People depended on you, and you depended on them, and that dependency was not shameful or embarrassing, but simply the ordinary condition of being alive. Nobody imagined they should be able to manage entirely alone. The idea would have seemed not admirable, but insane, and that sense of belonging gave medieval villagers something that modern psychologists now consider essential to emotional well-being: the deep, unspoken background knowledge that when life became difficult, you almost certainly would not be facing it entirely by yourself. That knowledge does something remarkable to the nervous system. It lowers the volume on everything. A threat that you face alone is a much larger threat than the same threat faced with 20 other people. Your body knows this. Your body has always known this. Now let me take you somewhere specific. Let me take you to the end of a medieval working day, because I think it might be the single most enviable hour in the whole of pre-modern life. Picture it. You have spent the entire day in the fields. Your back aches in that particular deep way that only physical labour produces. Your boots are caked in mud that has begun to dry and is now essentially a second pair of boots. You have argued at length with at least one particularly stubborn sheep who continues to believe, sincerely and without evidence, that your vegetable garden belongs to him. And then the sun begins to sink toward the horizon, and something remarkable happens. Your workday ends. Not because you finished everything. You did not finish everything. Nobody ever finished everything. There were always more weeds to pull, more fences to mend, more tools to sharpen, more of every task that has ever existed on a farm. The list did not get shorter. The list has never once, in the entire history of agriculture, gotten shorter. It ended because nature made the decision for you. Once darkness fell, continuing to work became impractical, and in several cases actively dangerous, unless you particularly enjoyed the experience of striking your own thumb with a hammer by candlelight. Artificial light existed, but it was expensive and dim, and nobody was going to burn precious tallow so that you could get slightly ahead on fence repair. For most medieval people, daylight was the clock, the manager, and the closing bell all at once. When the light went, productivity went with it, and this was not a personal failing. It was simply the world. Compare that to now, where work follows you everywhere with remarkable devotion. It buzzes during dinner. It sits on the kitchen table. It reminds you gently that although you have already worked 9 hours, this might be an excellent moment to answer one more message. The boundary between working and resting has not been redrawn. It has been quietly dissolved, and most of us did not notice it dissolving until it was already gone. A medieval farmer had no such luxury and no such problem. No messenger arrived after sunset saying "quick question," followed by 6 pages of additional responsibilities. No lord dispatched a rider requesting revisions to yesterday's harvest before sunrise, and thankfully, mercifully, there was no medieval equivalent of a meeting that could have been a brief conversation. When evening arrived, the whole village shifted gears together, and that togetherness mattered enormously. You were not resting while others worked. Nobody was getting ahead of you. There was no competitive advantage available to the person who kept going, because nobody could keep going. Animals were fed and shut in. Tools were put away, because tools left out rusted, and rusted tools were a genuine expense. Smoke rose from cottages as simple meals were prepared, pottage most nights, that endless, adaptable, slightly different everyday stew of grain and vegetables, and whatever else the season had provided. Families gathered around the fire with bread, cheese, and ale. Children listened to stories they had already heard dozens of times, and somehow still found entertaining. Because children have always understood something that adults forget, which is that the pleasure of a story is not remotely dependent on not knowing the ending. Adults repaired clothing, carved wooden tools, spun wool, or simply talked. And here is the detail I find most striking. Conversation was not competing with anything. There was no glowing rectangle in the corner of the room quietly winning. Nobody glanced away halfway through your account of the unusually ambitious goose that had chased the blacksmith clean across the village green. If someone interrupted you, they at least had the decency to do it in person, with their whole face, while looking at you. Even sleep followed a healthier rhythm than most of us manage now, and the way medieval Europeans slept was, according to some historians, considerably stranger than you might expect. Without electric lighting, without screens, without anything glowing at all, most medieval people became naturally tired shortly after darkness settled in. Not tired in the modern sense, not that wired, jittery exhaustion where the body is finished but the mind is still running. Tired in the old way, the uncomplicated way, the way where you sit down beside a fire and your eyelids simply begin closing without consulting you first. And then something curious happened in the middle of the night. Historians have long argued that many pre-industrial Europeans practiced what is sometimes called segmented sleep. The idea, drawn from scattered references in letters, court records, medical texts, and literature, is that people would sleep for several hours, wake naturally somewhere around midnight, remain awake for perhaps an hour, and then return to a second sleep until dawn. And what did they do during that quiet interval? Apparently, whatever they liked. They prayed. They talked quietly with whoever was beside them. They tended the fire. They thought about things. Some historians suggest it was regarded as a particularly good time for reflection, and 1 or 2 medical writers of the period recommended it for other activities, which we shall move past politely. Now, we should be honest about the state of the evidence here. Not every historian agrees on how widespread this pattern was, and it is very possible it varied enormously by region, season, and household. Winter nights in northern Europe were extraordinarily long, 14, 15, 16 hours of darkness. And there is only so much sleeping a human body can do. It may simply be that when the night is that long, you get up in the middle of it, because there is nothing else to do with all those hours. But whether segmented sleep was universal or occasional, the underlying point stands, and it is not in dispute. Their bodies remained tied to natural light rather than artificial schedules. The sun told them when to be alert, darkness told them when to slow down. And crucially, this is the part that matters. Waking in the middle of the night was not a crisis. It was not evidence that something had gone wrong. It was not a problem requiring a solution. Consider how differently we treat the same experience. You wake at 2 a.m, and immediately the anxiety machine engages. Why am I awake? I have to be up in 5 hours. Now it's 4 hours. This is going to ruin tomorrow. Why does this keep happening? The waking itself is harmless. The panic about the waking is what actually costs you the night. A medieval villager waking at the same hour simply stirred the fire, listened to the wind and went back to sleep when they felt like it. No calculation. No dread. The night was long and there was plenty of it. Your brain incidentally evolved for exactly this pattern. Sunlight tells it when to be alert. Darkness tells it when to wind down. Today, many of us thoroughly confuse our own biology by staring into bright light until midnight and then lying in the dark wondering, with genuine bewilderment, why sleep refuses to arrive. Your ancestors' greatest evening distraction was probably somebody outside shouting, "Has anyone seen my pig?" And honestly, as a sleep disturbance, that's manageable. Of course, medieval nights were not always peaceful. Let's keep our feet on the ground. A storm might threaten the harvest and keep an entire household listening to the roof. A sick child could keep everyone awake in the worst possible way. Winter nights were long, genuinely cold, and sometimes filled with real fear about food stores, about the ill, about whether the wood would last. But even so, there remained one enormous difference from modern life. Rest was not something you had to schedule. You did not have to decide to stop. You did not have to justify stopping, or feel guilty about stopping, or negotiate with yourself about whether you had earned it. Rest simply arrived every single evening with the setting sun, quietly informing you that tomorrow's work would be handled tomorrow, by tomorrow's version of you. Now let's talk about choice, because I think this may be the single most underrated source of modern anxiety, and the one our ancestors would find hardest to understand. If you walked into a medieval home and asked, brightly, "So, what are my options today?" the answer would be wonderfully, almost comically short. You can eat what is in the pot. You can wear what is hanging on that peg. You can do the work that needs doing. That's the list. That's the whole list. Modern life, by contrast, is built entirely on choice, and we have been told for a very long time that more choice makes us freer and therefore happier. The first half of that is true. The second half turns out to be considerably more complicated. Psychologists have spent decades studying what happens when the number of options rises past a certain point, and the finding is consistent enough to have earned a name: the paradox of choice. Beyond a certain threshold, additional options stop feeling like freedom and start feeling like work. Your brain has to evaluate, compare, and eliminate. And then, having chosen, it does something genuinely unhelpful. It begins wondering about the options you didn't take. That's the trap. It is not the choosing that exhausts you. It is the residue of everything you didn't choose, sitting quietly in the back of your mind, whispering that one of them might have been better. Sound familiar? You spend 15 minutes deciding what to watch, and then spend the entire evening scrolling through descriptions instead. You have not been entertained. You have not rested. You have simply performed 40 minutes of unpaid evaluation work. Congratulations, you have experienced a problem that would utterly baffle a medieval peasant. In the Middle Ages, your wardrobe was refreshingly uncomplicated. Most ordinary people owned a handful of garments: a linen shift or shirt worn against the skin, woolen outer clothing for daily work, a cloak for cold weather, and one better set reserved for church, weddings, and feast days. Clothing was expensive, genuinely expensive, representing real labour, since somebody had to spin the thread and weave the cloth, and it was mended, remade, handed down, and eventually cut into something else entirely. Nobody stood before a chest sighing dramatically that they had absolutely nothing to wear. If you had said it, your wife would have pointed at the shirt you wore yesterday and the day before and would be wearing tomorrow, and the conversation would have concluded. Fashion certainly existed, vigorously, among nobles and wealthy merchants. Kings adored luxurious fabrics, brilliant dyes, and elaborate clothing that announced "Observe how wealthy I am" to everyone in the room. And some medieval rulers passed actual laws attempting to stop lower ranks from dressing above their station, which tells you exactly how seriously people took it. But for the overwhelming majority of society, practicality won every time, and it won without a fight. The same simplicity applied to food. You did not debate between cuisines. Dinner depended almost entirely on the season and on what was within walking distance. Fresh vegetables appeared when they grew and vanished when they stopped. Bread was baked from whatever grain grew locally, wheat if you were fortunate, more often rye, barley, or oats. Cheese came from local animals. Meat was an occasional luxury for most families rather than a daily expectation, though eggs, dairy, and fish filled a great deal of the gap. You ate what nature had provided, not what happened to be on special offer after comparing 14 reviews of establishments you have never visited. Even careers involved remarkably few decisions, as we've discussed. Most children learned their parents' work or entered apprenticeships arranged through family connections, and the arrangement was usually settled by adults, while the child in question was busy being a child. You were not lying awake wondering whether becoming a blacksmith might make you happier than becoming a cooper, while secretly harbouring ambitions in candle making. Life was already busy enough without inventing additional questions. Now I want to be very careful here, because this is exactly the point where romanticising becomes dishonest. Fewer choices did not always mean greater happiness. Sometimes it meant quiet, lifelong frustration. A gifted farmer might have possessed the mind of a scholar and never once been given the chance to use it. A talented girl might have had every quality required of a physician and been offered no door at all, not even a locked one. Society closed those possibilities long before anyone could think to knock, and there is no charming way to describe that. It was a genuine waste of human potential on an enormous scale, repeated across every generation. That absence of freedom was real, and it mattered, and no amount of pleasant candlelight changes it. But here is what we can honestly take from it. For the countless small decisions that quietly drain us every single day, the ones with no moral weight, no long-term significance, and no correct answer, medieval life offered genuine relief. There were fewer purchases to research, fewer paths to compare, fewer voices insisting that happiness was one modest purchase away. Nobody tried to sell you a revolutionary new wooden bucket that would completely transform your relationship with water. Your old bucket carried water. That was, in fact, the entire specification of a bucket, and it had been met. Perhaps that is the great irony hiding in all of this. Medieval people owned dramatically less than we do. A family's total possessions might have fit in a single cart, and yet they also spent dramatically less time wondering whether they ought to own something different. Their minds were occupied by living a life rather than continuously optimizing one, and optimizing, it turns out, is exhausting in a way that living is not. Now let's turn to something heavier, because we cannot talk honestly about the medieval mind without talking about how they handled the thing that frightens us most, not knowing why. Imagine waking one morning to discover that your crops have begun to fail. The weather has been strange for weeks. Your youngest child has developed a fever that has not broken. The water from the village well tastes faintly different, and nobody can say why. Today, most of us would do the same thing. We would search and 5 minutes later we would have convinced ourselves that the crop has an exotic fungus previously documented on one remote island, that the fever matches 17 different conditions all requiring immediate attention, and that our own mild headache is almost certainly catastrophic. Our anxiety would have risen by roughly 200%, and we would have learned essentially nothing useful. A medieval villager did not have that option. What they had instead was something we have largely set down, a complete and unbroken explanation for absolutely everything that happened to them. And whatever you personally believe about it, its effect on the human nervous system was extraordinary. That explanation was faith. Whether you lived in England, France, the German lands, or almost anywhere in Christian Europe, religion was not something you attended on Sundays and set aside on Monday. It was not a compartment of life. It was the structure inside which life happened, the ceiling, the floor, and the walls. Good harvests, bad harvests, storms, illness, unexpected recovery, birth, death. The turning of the seasons themselves, all of it fit inside a larger story that you had known since before you could remember learning it. Life might not always make sense in the way you wanted it to, but it always had meaning. And those are entirely different things, and the difference is enormous. Modern psychology keeps arriving at the same finding: uncertainty is among the most reliable engines of anxiety. Human beings are astonishingly good at enduring hardship when they believe there is a purpose behind it. What truly destabilizes us is the suspicion that suffering is random, meaningless, and completely beyond explanation, that things simply happen, for no reason, to no end, and could happen again tomorrow. For medieval people, uncertainty almost always had an answer waiting for it. Perhaps this hardship was a test of patience. Perhaps the village had grown careless and needed to return to better habits. Perhaps this suffering was part of something larger that would eventually make sense, if not here then elsewhere. Perhaps a particular saint should be appealed to, or a pilgrimage undertaken, or a candle lit. Now, and I want to be careful and respectful here, whether those explanations were correct is genuinely not the point of tonight's discussion, and I am not going to pretend to settle it. What matters for our purposes is the psychological effect they produced. They offered stability. They gave the mind somewhere to rest. The question stopped somewhere instead of continuing forever. Because that is what modern anxiety so often is. A question that will not stop. A mind that keeps walking down the corridor looking for a door and finding only more corridor. Religion also filled the calendar with rhythm, and rhythm, as we've seen, is medicine. Church bells marked the hours of the day, not just the time, but which time, and what it was for. Weekly services gathered the entire community in one room where everybody could see everybody and be seen. The year itself was shaped by feasts and fasts, Lent's long austerity, Easter's release, harvest celebrations, saints' days scattered through the calendar like markers on a road. And crucially, many of those days were days when work stopped. Genuinely stopped. Not stopped, but checking. Stopped. There is a claim you may have encountered that medieval peasants enjoyed more holidays than the modern worker. The truth is more complicated and varied hugely by place and century, and historians argue about it energetically. But the underlying observation holds. The year contained regular, communal, non-negotiable pauses that no individual had to justify or request or feel guilty about. Nobody had to be brave enough to take a rest day. The calendar took it for them, and it took it for everyone at once. Ritual did something else too. It gave people something to do when there was nothing to be done. That may be the most underrated function of religion in a world without medicine. When your child is ill, and no physician exists who can help, the alternative to prayer is not calm, rational acceptance. The alternative is helplessness, sitting in a dark room with a mind screaming at you to act while there is no action available. Ritual absorbed that energy. It converted terrible helplessness into activity, pray, light the candle, walk to the shrine, make the offering, ask the priest. Whatever else it accomplished, it gave frantic hands something to hold. We have quietly lost that mechanism and largely failed to replace it. When something is beyond our control today, we tend to research it instead, which feels like action but generally produces more fear rather than less. Now let me offer you another gift the medieval world gave its people, one you may find almost impossible to imagine. Imagine waking tomorrow with a single enormous realization. You no longer have to impress anyone. Not your employer, not strangers, not people you attended school with who appear somehow to own 3 holiday homes despite a documented indifference to mathematics. In medieval society, your position in the world was usually settled long before you were old enough to worry about it. Born to a farming family, you farmed. Born to a carpenter, you spent your childhood learning to shape timber, rather than wondering whether you might be better suited to something more expressive. Born into the nobility, your responsibilities were entirely different, but no less clearly defined, and often no less binding, because a lord's son did not get to decide he would rather not be a lord. For most people, there was no endless ladder waiting to be climbed. There was simply life, and it was already the correct shape. That was unfair, and it was unfair in ways that damaged real people. A peasant could not decide to become a wealthy merchant. A poor family could not send its clever children to be educated. Society placed firm limits on ambition, and those limits could be genuinely crushing. But there was an unexpected side effect. You spent almost no time measuring yourself against impossible standards, because impossible standards were not presented to you as options you had failed to take. Today, comparison has become something close to a full-time occupation, conducted mostly without our consent. Someone your age has started a company. Someone else has run a marathon. Someone is renovating a beautiful old house, while apparently also baking their own bread and documenting the process before breakfast. Meanwhile, you are quietly celebrating because you remembered where you put your keys. Modern life introduces you constantly and involuntarily to people who appear more successful than you. Not people who are, people who appear. And your brain, which was built to keep track of a village, dutifully keeps score against a population of millions. Medieval villages had much smaller scoreboards, and, as we've touched on, the entries were honest. You compared yourself to the blacksmith, the miller, the priest, the most prosperous farmer. 4 or 5 people. And their lives were not curated highlights designed to make an ordinary Tuesday look extraordinary. You saw the whole picture, including the parts nobody would choose to display. There was another crucial difference, and I think it may be the most important idea in this entire section. Success had a finish line. If your family had enough food, a sound roof, healthy animals, and a good reputation, you had succeeded. That was it. That was the target, and it was reachable, and people reached it, and having reached it, they were permitted to feel that things were well. The goal was not to be richer every year. The goal was stability, to survive, to provide, to leave your children in a position no worse, and ideally slightly better than the one you inherited. That kind of success has an edge to it. You can arrive at it. You can stand on it. Modern ambition frequently has no edge at all. There is always another promotion, another investment, another qualification, another milestone promising that satisfaction is waiting just beyond it. It is like walking toward the horizon. Every step you take, it takes one too, and the distance between you never changes by a single inch. And because it never changes, you never get to stop. And because you never get to stop, some low-grade tension never fully releases. Medieval people certainly wanted better lives. Do not imagine them as saints of contentment. They negotiated, litigated, schemed, and occasionally revolted. But they also accepted something our society finds almost embarrassing to say aloud. Not everyone needs to be extraordinary. Being known as an honest neighbour, a reliable craftsman, someone who showed up when help was needed, that carried genuine weighty respect. You did not need an audience. You needed people who trusted you, and you needed perhaps 30 of them, and you already knew all of their names. So here is the irony. Medieval society offered dramatically fewer opportunities, and in doing so it spared people one of the heaviest psychological burdens of modern life, the constant, low, exhausting feeling that you ought to be becoming someone else. Sometimes simply being enough is one of the greatest luxuries a human mind can be handed. Let's move now to the evening again, but this time to what people actually did with it, because entertainment, of all things, turns out to matter enormously for anxiety. After a long day, a medieval villager faced a genuinely difficult decision. Should you listen to the travelling storyteller who arrived yesterday? Play a game of tables with your neighbours? Watch the village musicians? Or simply sit by the fire while your grandfather tells, once again, the story of the enormous fish he very nearly caught 30 years ago? I should mention, for accuracy, that the fish grows every winter. It has been growing since before you were born. By now it is roughly the size of a rowing boat and shows no sign of stopping. Entertainment in the Middle Ages was not endless, and that is precisely why it remains special. Today, entertainment never stops, and it never wants to. Your television offers thousands of options. Your phone contains an effectively infinite supply of videos. Music streams without end. News updates arrive minute by minute. Every application is competing, with considerable skill and substantial investment, for the next spare second of your attention, each quietly suggesting that 5 more minutes could not possibly hurt. And then somehow it is 1 a.m, and you have become deeply personally invested in a stranger restoring a castle in rural Wales. You do not live in Wales. You have never been to Wales. You now have opinions about their choice of roofing slate. A medieval villager simply could not consume information at that rate. It was not that they had more discipline than you. It was that the supply did not exist. When the day's work ended, entertainment required people. Someone had to tell the story. Someone had to play the fiddle. Someone had to sing or dance or start the game. And if nobody did, then everyone simply talked, and conversation itself became the evening. People shared local news, family history, legends, jokes, and gossip. Enormous quantities of gossip. If medieval villagers had invented reality television, nobody would have watched it. They already had old Thomas explaining, at length and with considerable narrative skill, why the baker's daughter had been seen speaking with the cooper's son behind the church for very nearly 15 minutes. That was premium content. That was appointment viewing, but storytelling held a special place, and here modern neuroscience has something genuinely interesting to say about why that mattered, and why the way we're entertained today might be part of what's leaving us so restless. Long before books were common, before most people could read at all, history and folklore and heroic tales and religious teaching all travelled the same way. From a person's mouth to a person's ear, and then onward. Children learned stories by listening. Adults remembered them through repetition. A genuinely skilled storyteller could hold an entire room silent for hours using nothing but a good voice and excellent timing. And your imagination did most of the work. That detail matters more than it sounds. When you listen to a story without constant visual stimulation, your brain has to build the images itself. The castle, the forest, the face of the night, the colour of the sea. You are not receiving the story. You are constructing it, in collaboration with the person telling it, using materials from your own mind. You are participating. Modern entertainment usually demands almost nothing from you except continued attention. The screen does all the imagining, and it does it beautifully, at enormous expense, with better lighting than your imagination could ever manage. And that is genuinely wonderful. But it also means your mind sits still while being poured into, hour after hour. And a mind that is never asked to build anything gradually forgets that it can. There is a reason so many people find it difficult now to simply sit and think. The muscle is not gone, it is just extremely out of practice. Games, meanwhile, were social almost by definition. People played board games, variations of tables, which was the ancestor of what we'd now call backgammon, along with merrills, chess among the wealthier, and dice games everywhere, constantly, despite periodic attempts by authorities to discourage them. Dice were popular in exactly the way that things which are slightly disapproved of are always popular. Young people wrestled, raced, practiced archery, and played rough local ball games that varied from village to village and occasionally from one end of a village to the other. Some of these games were genuinely chaotic. Medieval football could involve entire parishes, no meaningful rules, and a level of injury that would concern a modern insurer. But nobody was counting steps, nobody was closing rings or hitting targets. You exercised because standing still all day would have seemed faintly bizarre, and because someone needed to chase the pig. And perhaps the greatest difference of all, the one I keep returning to, is that medieval entertainment had endings. When the storyteller finished, he stopped. When the musicians packed away their instruments, the evening drew to a close. There was no algorithm quietly whispering, "Since you enjoyed that, here are 347 more stories you must absolutely hear before sunrise." Instead, darkness settled. The fire burned low. People wished one another good night, walked a short distance home, and lay down. And their minds, having received precisely enough stimulation for one day, and not one particle more, were finally permitted to become wonderfully, peacefully bored. Which brings us to boredom, and I want to defend it for a moment, because it has developed an undeservedly poor reputation. Psychologists increasingly suspect that boredom is not a malfunction to be eliminated, but a necessary state, a kind of idling gear in which the brain sorts, consolidates, connects, and quietly processes everything that has happened. It is when unfinished thoughts finish themselves. It is when solutions arrive unbidden in the bath or on a walk. It is, arguably, where a great deal of human creativity actually comes from. We have very nearly abolished it. There is no longer any such thing as waiting. Every gap, the queue, the lift, the 3 minutes before a meeting, the moment before sleep, has been filled with something. And the moments we've filled were precisely the moments the mind used for recovery. Medieval people did not schedule digital detoxes or mindfulness retreats. They did not need to. Their world simply left enormous amounts of unfilled space around the edges of their attention, and their minds spread out into it and rested. Now, by this point in the evening, medieval life has probably begun to sound quite appealing. A slower pace, strong community, predictable routine. Nobody sending you anything at 11:30 at night asking whether you've had a chance to look at this yet. It is tempting to imagine yourself settling contentedly into a small cottage with fresh bread and a warm fire and the sound of rain on thatch. And then reality politely opens the door and walks in. Because while medieval people may have carried far less chronic, low-level anxiety than we do, they faced a completely different kind of pressure. One that was immediate. One that could not be postponed, negotiated, or worked around. One that could kill you. If your harvest failed, you could not simply obtain food from elsewhere. There was no elsewhere with a delivery service. If your roof collapsed in January, no repair service existed promising to arrive between 8 and 6. If your horse went lame halfway to market, your carefully planned day had just become tomorrow's problem, and tomorrow's problem was going to be handled by you, personally, on foot. Modern life produces thousands of small stresses. Medieval life produced fewer, but far, far larger ones. And that difference is genuinely important to understand, because it explains both what they had and what we have. Today, your heart rate might spike because you cannot recall a password for an account you have not used in 3 years. A medieval farmer's heart rate spiked because dark clouds gathered on the western horizon a week before harvest, threatening to destroy 9 months of labour in a single afternoon. One of those problems was inconvenient. The other determined whether a family ate through winter. And even ordinary accidents carried consequences that are hard for us to properly feel. A deep cut while chopping wood could become infected, and infection had no reliable treatment. A broken leg might prevent months of work at precisely the moment work was most needed. A toothache could progress into something genuinely dangerous, and the available interventions were limited, dramatic, and not accompanied by anything resembling anaesthetic. Suddenly that appointment with your dentist seems considerably less unreasonable. You still will not enjoy it. But nobody is proposing that the treatment involve heated iron and a great deal of enthusiastic prayer. Life expectancy shaped everything about their outlook. And this is where we have to be genuinely serious for a moment. Death was visible in a way that is difficult for most modern societies to imagine. It happened at home, in the same room where everything else happened, witnessed by everyone including the children. Infant and child mortality was devastating by our standards. Diseases moved through communities quickly and without explanation. Childbirth carried real and well-understood danger for mothers, and everybody knew it, including the mothers. Families became familiar with grief in a way that would break most of us. This was not a society that had made peace with loss. It was a society that had no choice but to live alongside it. And yet, and this is the strange, difficult, valuable part, that constant awareness sometimes produced a different relationship with ordinary time. Life felt fragile because it was fragile. And fragility, unexpectedly, makes ordinary moments matter more. Religious festivals, family meals, a successful harvest, a healthy child, a mild winter, none of these were taken for granted. They were noticed. They were remarked upon. They were celebrated properly, because everyone understood precisely how quickly circumstances could change. Modern people, by contrast, have developed an unusual habit. We postpone happiness. I'll relax after this project. I'll enjoy things once I've been promoted. I'll spend more time with the family next year, when it's calmer, and the finish line politely moves, as finish lines do, and next year arrives already occupied. Medieval people could rarely afford that illusion, because tomorrow genuinely was not guaranteed, and everyone had personal evidence of this. So when the village gathered for a feast, people laughed properly. When musicians played, people danced, badly, energetically, in front of everyone they knew. When friends shared ale by the fire, they stayed a little longer than they had meant to. Not because life was easy, precisely because they knew exactly how hard it could become. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson hidden underneath medieval life. Their world was not calm because it lacked suffering. Their world was calm when it was calm, because people accepted that suffering was a component of life, rather than treating each hardship as evidence that something had gone catastrophically and unfairly wrong. That acceptance did not remove pain. Nothing removes pain. But it frequently prevented pain from curdling into permanent anxiety, because they were not simultaneously suffering and protesting the fact of suffering. We often do both, and the second one costs more than we realise. Now let's look directly at the worst of it, because I promised you honesty tonight, and because you cannot understand medieval calm without understanding medieval catastrophe. For all the gentle rhythms we have described, medieval life had one enormous flaw. When things went wrong, they went comprehensively wrong. There was very little middle ground, and almost no cushioning. Most of the year followed familiar patterns. You worked, worshipped, celebrated, and watched the seasons turn. But every so often, disaster arrived without warning, and the peaceful routine that had kept everyone's mind so steady simply evaporated within days. Imagine it is late summer. Your wheat is nearly ready after months of labour. You have walked the fields every evening, watching, calculating, knowing that in another week your family will have enough grain to carry them through winter. Then the clouds gather. The rain begins. Not for an afternoon, for days. The fields turn to standing water. Grain begins to rot where it stands, before it can be cut. Every hour you look out and hope the sky will clear. It does not. That is not disappointing. That is terrifying, in a way that most of us have thankfully never experienced. Today, one bad month might force you to be careful for a while. A failed harvest could threaten an entire region. Food prices rose sharply after poor harvests. Bread became expensive precisely when people had least money. Families stretched every meal further, then further again, and a run of bad years, 2-3 consecutive failures, could produce genuine famine, as Northern Europe discovered catastrophically in the second decade of the 14th century, when years of relentless rain produced a famine that killed an enormous portion of the population before the plague ever arrived. Even wealthy nobles worried when several bad seasons followed one another, because hungry peasants were rarely contented peasants, and history demonstrates repeatedly that hungry people eventually stop asking politely. And then, of course, there was disease, which is where medieval anxiety, when it came, arrived in a form we would recognise instantly and wish we hadn't. Modern anxiety usually concerns problems that never actually arrive. This is, in a strange way, its defining feature. We rehearse disasters that do not come. Medieval disease had the deeply unpleasant habit of actually arriving. A fever moving through the village was not something you followed at a distance through reports. It was happening in the house next door. You watched familiar people disappear from daily life. The church bell rang more frequently, and rang for different reasons. Houses that had always been noisy became strangely quiet, and everyone walking past them knew exactly why. Nobody understood bacteria. Nobody understood viruses. Physicians worked with the best framework available to them, the theory of the four humours, inherited from the ancient world, which held that health depended on the balance of blood, phlegm, and 2 forms of bile. It was a coherent, sophisticated, internally logical system. It was also wrong, which is a difficult combination. Treatments followed the theory, bleeding to reduce excess, particular foods to restore balance, herbal preparations, and adjustments to sleep, air, and exercise. Some of it helped. Herbal medicine in particular contained genuine pharmacological knowledge accumulated over centuries. Willow bark for pain, for instance, contains a compound closely related to aspirin. Much of it did nothing, some of it actively harmed, and underneath all of it sat an enormous quantity of hope, which is a lovely thing, but an extremely unreliable prescription. Then, in the middle of the 14th century, came the event that reshaped the entire continent. The plague arrived in Europe around 1347, moving along trade routes with terrible efficiency, and within a handful of years it had killed something in the region of 1/3 to half of the population. Historians still debate the precise figure, and it varied enormously by region. But the scale is beyond genuine dispute. Some villages lost a few people, some lost nearly everyone. Some were abandoned entirely and never reoccupied, and their outlines can still be traced in English fields today as faint ridges in the grass. Think about what that does to a worldview built on order and meaning. Everything we have discussed tonight, the predictability, the certainty, the comfort of inherited rhythm, all of it was tested by an event that made no sense within any framework anyone possessed. People sought explanations desperately, and some of those explanations turned dark and cruel, producing appalling persecution of Jewish communities across parts of Europe by populations searching for someone to blame. That is part of this history too, and it deserves to be named rather than skipped past. So no, the medieval mind was not immune to catastrophic anxiety. When the framework broke, it broke badly, and people responded with everything from extraordinary courage to extraordinary cruelty, which is generally how human beings respond to anything. War added another layer entirely. Even if you never held a weapon, armies rarely passed through a region without affecting everyone in it. Fields were trampled or deliberately destroyed. Livestock was taken, sometimes with payment and sometimes without. Villages were looted. Refugees arrived from places only a few days' walk away, carrying stories that made your own quiet corner of the world suddenly feel much less secure. And medieval warfare, particularly in periods like the long conflict between England and France, often involved deliberate raiding of agricultural land as a strategy, the destruction of the enemy's food supply being considerably more decisive than any battle. Yet here is something remarkable. and it is the reason I wanted to walk you through the darkness before returning to the light. When these crises passed, people generally returned to ordinary life astonishingly quickly. The fields still needed planting, children still laughed, because children do. Markets reopened. Church bells rang once again for weddings rather than funerals. Life moved forward, not because anyone had processed anything or recovered properly by our standards, but because it had to, and because the alternative was starvation. There is something almost bewildering about this to modern eyes. We might expect a generation to be permanently broken. In many ways they were changed profoundly. The plague reshaped the economy of Europe, shattered the old bargain between lords and labourers, and made surviving workers far more valuable and far less obedient. But daily life reasserted itself with a speed that historians still find striking. Perhaps modern societies struggle more in the aftermath of hardship, partly because we expect life to remain comfortable as the default condition. When something disrupts that, it feels not just painful but wrong, a violation of the terms. Medieval people never held that expectation. They understood peace as something precious precisely because it was fragile and temporary and had to be enjoyed while it lasted. Their anxiety, when it came, arrived in waves. Famine, plague, war, a brutal winter, and then, whenever fortune permitted, ordinary life slowly reclaimed its familiar rhythm, and when it returned, people embraced it with a gratitude that most of us only discover after our own lives have been unexpectedly turned upside down. That, I think, is worth sitting with. They were not calmer because less went wrong. They were calmer between the storms because they knew what the storms cost and were properly grateful for the intervals. Now let's do something enjoyable. Let's put a medieval villager and a modern psychologist in the same room and see what happens. Here is the funny part. If you describe the daily habits of medieval life to a researcher today, carefully leaving out the castles, the knights, the sanitation, and the periodic plague, they would very likely nod approvingly and say yes, those are excellent practices for managing anxiety. I am only slightly exaggerating. Over the last several decades, researchers have spent an enormous amount of effort investigating what actually makes people calmer, happier, and more resilient. And again they keep arriving at conclusions that would have sounded blindingly obvious to an ordinary villager in 1300. Start with light and sleep. Scientists now understand that natural sunlight helps regulate the body's internal clock, and that morning light exposure in particular improves sleep quality, supports mood, and helps regulate stress hormones. Getting outside early in the day is one of the most consistently recommended, cheapest, and least glamorous interventions available. A medieval farmer would have found this advice puzzling to the point of comedy. Well, yes, he had been outside since first light, because cows have never once demonstrated any interest in respecting a lie-in. Then there is movement. Today, millions of people drive to a building containing machines so that they can walk on a moving belt while watching a screen depicting someone walking through a forest. A medieval peasant would find this profoundly confusing. You paid money to pretend to walk. Past the actual outdoors, which was free. Physical activity was not a separate category of medieval life. It was simply what living consisted of. People walked nearly everywhere. They lifted, carried, chopped, dug, climbed, hauled, planted, harvested, and repaired things every single day. Their bodies moved constantly, not toward a fitness goal, but because bread required it. And modern medicine consistently demonstrates that regular physical movement reduces anxiety, supports mood, and helps regulate the body's stress response. Medieval villagers accidentally discovered this several centuries before anyone thought to invent a treadmill. Community is another striking example, and we've already spent time here, but the research deserves stating plainly. Study after study finds that close relationships and strong social connection are among the very best predictors of long-term well-being, better predictors, in some famous long-running studies, than wealth, fame, or professional achievement. People embedded in supportive communities recover from hardship more quickly, and carry less chronic stress. That sounds remarkably like village life. Your neighbours were not optional. Sometimes they were irritating. Sometimes they borrowed your tools and returned them in a condition that raised uncomfortable questions about what exactly had occurred. But they were there, and when life became difficult, they generally showed up, and everyone knew they would. Researchers also emphasise routine. Predictable daily patterns reduce mental fatigue because the brain expends less energy on constant small decisions and less energy anticipating an unknown future. Sound familiar? The medieval calendar was essentially one long routine, interrupted at pleasant intervals by harvest festivals, saints' days, and the occasional goose pursuing someone across the green. Even gratitude has become a serious area of psychological research, with reasonably consistent findings that people who regularly notice and appreciate ordinary parts of life report greater well-being and lower stress. Medieval people rarely needed a reminder to appreciate a successful harvest, a healthy child, or a warm meal at the end of a cold day. They knew with absolute clarity how easily each of those could vanish. And nature, the thing we now prescribe in doses. There is a growing body of research suggesting that time spent in green spaces reduces stress markers and improves mood. Medieval people did not visit nature. They lived inside it, permanently, with no door between. But, and this is essential, and I will not let tonight end without saying it clearly, modern science also reminds us of something equally important. Let us keep antibiotics. Let us keep clean drinking water. Let us keep vaccines, and anesthesia and germ theory, and the extraordinary luxury of living in a world where cutting your finger while slicing bread does not become the defining medical event of your year. Let us keep the ability of women to survive childbirth as a matter of routine. Let us keep the fact that most children born today will grow up. The medieval world was not gentler. It was simply differently hard. It exchanged our 1,000 small anxieties for a much smaller number of enormous, genuine dangers, and given a free choice, most of us would take the 1,000 small ones, and we would be right to. The goal was never to return. That was never the point of tonight. The goal is to notice that while technology has solved a staggering number of physical problems, it has not automatically solved the problems inside our heads, and that some of what we removed in the process turns out to have been load-bearing. So perhaps the healthiest future is not a choice between the medieval world and the modern one. Perhaps it is simply borrowing the best habits from both, and being clear-eyed about which parts of the past were genuinely worth keeping, and which parts were merely picturesque from a distance. Now, before we begin drawing tonight's threads together, I want to take you somewhere else entirely. Because the medieval world was much larger than an English village, and there were other people, thousands of miles east, living lives shaped by an entirely different kind of certainty. Let me take you to a caravan camp in Central Asia, several hours before dawn. Long before the first light climbs over the mountains, your day has already begun. You do not wake because a bell rings or because anyone shakes your shoulder. You wake because thousands of years of accumulated experience have taught caravan leaders that the coolest hours belong to travellers, and every minute spent asleep after dawn is another minute spent walking beneath an unforgiving afternoon sun. Whether you are crossing desert, plateau, or the windswept steppe, the rule never changes. Leave early or suffer later, your eyes open beneath a wool blanket stiff with the night's chill. Desert nights have a habit of reminding you that yesterday's blazing heat was only ever temporary and possessed no loyalty to anyone. The stars still hang overhead, brighter than anything most modern people have ever seen, no cities anywhere near, no electric glow on any horizon, no aircraft crossing the heavens, only silence, interrupted occasionally by the grunt of a camel who clearly disagrees with the entire concept of mornings. Around you, the camp is barely more than scattered shadows. Merchants from China sleep near Persian traders. Sogdian interpreters, those extraordinary middlemen of the trade routes, whose language became the commercial common tongue of much of Central Asia, lie curled beneath heavy cloaks. A Buddhist monk rests a few paces from a Muslim camel driver. Somewhere beyond them, an Indian spice merchant snores with remarkable confidence for a man transporting a substantial portion of his family's fortune across several thousand miles of uncertainty. Nobody shouts to wake the camp. The camp simply stirs, slowly, like a large animal stretching. A cough travels through the dark. Someone feeds another piece of dried dung into a dying fire, producing just enough warmth to argue with the cold. Leather bags rustle. Wooden bowls knock softly against one another. A horse stamps at the frozen ground, impatient, already eager to move. You learn quickly that sleeping late is a luxury reserved for people who own houses rather than camels. Now, why am I taking you here on a night about medieval anxiety? Because this is the same world we have been discussing, viewed from an entirely different angle, and it reveals something the English village alone cannot. These travellers had none of the certainty we spent the earlier sections praising. They had no fixed fields, no unchanging horizon, no village that had held their family for 6 generations. They spent their lives moving through unfamiliar and frequently dangerous terrain. And yet they were not, by any account we have, anxious people in our modern sense. They were something else, prepared. Watch what they do, and you'll see it. The caravan itself might contain anywhere from a few dozen travellers to several hundred. Larger expeditions moved with hundreds of camels carrying silk, porcelain, spices, paper, precious stones, glassware, perfumes, and occasionally diplomatic gifts of extraordinary value. Every animal, every crate, every person has a designated place, and that place is maintained with something close to military precision before departure. Chaos, out here, is astonishingly expensive. As you pull yourself upright, cold air bites at your face. Your fingers are stiff as you fold your blanket and gather your possessions. There is no suitcase beside a hotel bed. Everything you own must fit either onto your back or onto a camel who already holds several strong opinions about carrying it. For a moment you look east. The horizon has begun shifting from black toward deep blue. Dawn is still hidden, but it is coming quickly, and soon this scattered camp will become a moving river of people stretching across the landscape, following routes that have connected civilizations for centuries. By the time the eastern glow brightens, the transformation is astonishing. A collection of sleeping strangers has become something resembling a small town, one with no walls, no buildings, and no square, and yet everyone knows precisely where to go and what to do. The Road Rewards Organisation. It has very little patience for confusion. Nobody wastes words this early. The caravan leader walks through the camp with a simple staff, quietly confirming that everyone is awake. He does not need to bark orders. His authority comes entirely from experience. He knows where the next reliable well sits. He knows which mountain pass is safe this season and which is not. And most importantly, he knows that a single poor decision can strand hundreds of people in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Around him, dozens of small fires flicker back into life. Travellers warm their hands while conserving every scrap of fuel, because across much of Central Asia firewood is essentially non-existent, and dried camel or horse dung serves as the morning's fuel. It does not smell like anything you would choose for your home. It burns extremely well. You decide not to comment, since everyone else seems perfectly satisfied and nobody has yet invented a system for reviewing campsites. Nearby, merchants inspect yesterday's cargo with real seriousness. Rolls of silk remain sealed inside waterproof coverings. Sacks of pepper, cinnamon, cloves and saffron are checked for moisture, because moisture ruins spice and ruined spice is ruined profit. Delicate porcelain is examined for cracks after another night of swaying on the back of an animal. A single damaged crate can erase months of anticipated gain before the journey is even half finished. The languages around you are as varied as the merchandise. Persian besides Sogdian. Turkic dialects mixing with Chinese, Arabic, Sanskrit, occasionally Greek. Almost nobody understands everything, which is precisely why interpreters are among the most valuable members of any expedition. Out here, speaking several languages can earn you nearly as much respect as carrying a sword, and considerably more employment. The animals now announce that they too are awake. Camels groan theatrically, personally offended by the arrival of another morning. Horses snort into the cold. Donkeys bray without warning or apparent motive. Bells hanging from harnesses produce a gentle chorus that carries across empty landscape. It is loud enough to wake anyone still sleeping, though anyone still sleeping at this point is not going to remain popular for long. Within an hour, the peaceful camp has become a coordinated machine. Every movement serves a purpose. Every minute has value. And every traveller understands one simple truth. The road is waiting, and it does not wait forever. Breakfast, when it comes, is not a leisurely affair. Nobody unfolds elegant tables or debates between sweet and savoury. The Silk Road was many things: a highway of commerce, a meeting place of civilizations, a bridge between East and West, but it was emphatically not a resort. The meal must be quick, nourishing, and portable, and it looks remarkably different depending on who you're standing beside. A merchant from northern China unwraps steamed wheat buns prepared the previous evening. A Persian trader tears pieces from a flat loaf, dipping them into soft cheese made from sheep's milk. An Indian traveller eats dried fruit mixed with nuts. Turkish nomads pass around fermented dairy, which is rich in calories and startlingly filling. You decide to try everything, which seems like an excellent cultural education, right up until someone offers you a bowl of fermented mare's milk. It is memorable. Let's simply say that if coffee wakes a person with caffeine, fermented mare's milk achieves a comparable result through sheer surprise. Bread is the foundation of nearly every breakfast here, and for good reason. Flatbreads survive days inside a leather bag without spoiling, which makes them ideal companions for long journeys. They are eaten alongside dates, raisins, figs, almonds, walnuts, or pistachios. Food's dense with energy and light enough to cross continents. Fresh fruit is a rare luxury unless the caravan happens to be passing through fertile valleys or approaching a city. Meat appears occasionally, usually dried or salted weeks earlier. Cooking fresh meat before sunrise would represent an unnecessary delay, and delays have an unfortunate tendency to become disasters once the afternoon heat arrives. Water is treated with something close to reverence. Nobody pours a generous cup simply because they feel like it. Every sip is measured. The caravan leader knows exactly how much remains in each skin, and how many days separate the expedition from the next reliable spring or caravanserai, those extraordinary roadside inns, built at intervals along the trade routes, offering walls, water and safety to anyone who reached them before dark. Waste today becomes desperation tomorrow. Everyone understands this without needing to be told. And here, right here, is why I brought you across the world tonight. Look at what these people do with uncertainty. They do not eliminate it. They cannot. The desert will do what the desert does. Bandits may or may not appear. The pass may or may not be open. Illness may arrive. The weather owes them nothing. Instead, they systematically convert uncertainty into procedure. Every strap is checked. Every water skin is counted. Every load is balanced. Every rumour is weighed and either believed or discarded. Every morning follows the same sequence performed by the same people in the same order. And when the unpredictable finally arrives, as it always does, they meet it with a body already prepared and a mind that has been rehearsing competence rather than catastrophe. That is a fundamentally different relationship with the unknown than most of us have. We tend to manage uncertainty by thinking about it. We imagine outcomes. We plan conversations that will never occur. We rehearse disasters in vivid detail and mistake that rehearsal for preparation, when in fact it is simply suffering in advance. These travellers managed uncertainty by doing things. Small, concrete, physical, repeatable things, and the psychological effect of that is enormous, because a mind engaged in checking a harness is a mind that is not simultaneously constructing imaginary catastrophes. Watch the morning rituals, and you'll see this everywhere, in every tradition present in the camp. A Muslim merchant unrolls a small prayer rug on level ground and quietly performs the dawn prayer, one of the 5 that shape his day regardless of where on earth he happens to be standing. His companions respectfully avoid walking in front of him. Trade is important. Faith keeps its scheduled place in the morning. Nearby, a Buddhist monk sits cross-legged with remarkable stillness. His possessions would fit inside a single bundle, and yet his calm presence somehow occupies more space than the heavily loaded wagons beside him. He recites softly while moving prayer beads through his fingers, preparing his mind before preparing his feet. Across the camp, a Christian traveller from Mesopotamia traces the sign of the cross before finishing the last of his flatbread. The Zoroastrian trader from Persia faces the growing light in silent reflection, offering prayers associated with truth and the sacred order of the world, the rising sun reminding him of divine light, though he does not worship the sun itself, whatever outsiders sometimes assumed. Chinese merchants begin differently. Some burn a pinch of incense before a small travel shrine dedicated to ancestors or to deities believed to watch over traders. Others simply bow toward a wooden tablet, carefully wrapped inside their luggage. Along these roads, family remained close even when home was thousands of miles behind you. Then come the practical rituals, which serve almost exactly the same psychological function. Camel drivers inspect hooves one last time. Horsemen tighten saddle straps. Guards sharpen blades against wet stones and check bowstrings for wear. Physicians sort bundles of dried herbs, confirming that medicines have stayed dry through a cold night. Cooks count flour, salt, and dried fruit before supplies disappear beneath the cargo. And you develop your own ritual without deciding to. You stretch shoulders that have discovered muscles you never knew existed. You check your water. You adjust your belt. You count your belongings for what feels like the 10th time this morning. Nobody laughs at any of this. Experience has taught every traveller on this road the same lesson. Small routines prevent large disasters. A loose strap found now is infinitely preferable to a loose strap discovered halfway down a rocky mountain trail. That is not superstition. That is wisdom wearing the clothing of habit, and it is something we might usefully steal. Now let me take you somewhere else again, closer to home, but earlier in the morning than we've yet been, because there is a third medieval world worth visiting tonight, and it operated on entirely different principles from either the village or the road. Long before the castle gates open, before the kitchens fill with the smell of baking bread, before the Lord stirs beneath his heavy blankets, the fortress is already awake. Not everyone, of course. The fortunate people are still asleep. You are not one of them. The final watch of the night has always been considered the longest. Standing atop the curtain wall in the hours before dawn, you stamp your feet against cold stone to keep some feeling in your toes. Castles are magnificent from a distance, and have an unfortunate habit, up close, of allowing winter to explore every crack and corner. Even in summer, the hours before sunrise carry a chill that gets into the joints. Beyond the walls, the world is almost completely silent. Mist hangs low over the fields. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl finishes its night's hunting while a fox slips into the undergrowth. The village below is nothing but dark outlines beneath a spectacular canopy of stars. No streetlights, no distant traffic, no electrical hum. Only the occasional crackle of a dying torch and wind brushing the battlements. Every few minutes your eyes travel the roads leading toward the castle. Merchants sometimes arrive before sunrise, hoping for an early start. Messengers carrying urgent news often travel through the night. And less welcome visitors, raiders, bandits, enemy scouts have always preferred darkness for reasons that require no explanation. Tonight the roads remain empty. Still, the watch cannot relax. A castle survives because somebody is always paying attention. And here is the thing I want you to notice about castle life, because it connects directly to everything we've discussed. A castle is essentially a machine for managing fear. Every stone of it exists because somebody at some point was frightened of something specific. The thickness of the walls, the height of the towers, the angle of the arrow loops, the position of the well inside rather than outside, these are not decorations. They are answers to questions like what happens if 300 armed men arrive next spring. And once those answers are built into stone, an extraordinary thing occurs. The fear becomes handled. Not eliminated, handled, delegated to architecture. The people inside can go about the ordinary business of baking bread and mending harnesses precisely because the anxiety has been converted into masonry, and masonry does not need to be worried about every day. That is worth sitting with, because it is exactly what we struggle to do. We carry our fears around personally, in our heads, all day, every day. They had somewhere to put theirs. As the first pale light spreads, the castle's stillness begins to dissolve. The watch changes. Guards who have spent the night on the battlements make their way toward the gatehouse, faces tired, cloaks damp with dew, thinking about warm food and a few precious hours of sleep. Coming the other way are fresh men adjusting helmets and fastening belts, taking their places without ceremony. Every shift begins with the same exchange. Anything unusual? If the answer is nothing, everyone relaxes fractionally. If the answer is anything else, the morning suddenly becomes considerably more interesting. The gatehouse is easily the busiest building in the castle at this hour, and it is far more than a pair of doors. It is a fortress within the fortress, built to defend the weakest point in any wall, the hole you deliberately put in it. Massive oak gates reinforced with iron stand several inches thick. Above them waits the portcullis, a heavy iron shod lattice that can drop in seconds. Murder holes line the ceiling of the passage, allowing defenders to deal with anyone who fights their way inside. A charming welcome, provided you are arriving peacefully. The captain of the guard begins his inspection. He checks that the locking beams survived the night undamaged. Hinges are examined for cracks. Chains supporting the drawbridge are inspected link by link. Every mechanism is tested before anyone touches the controls, because a broken chain at the wrong moment converts an ordinary morning into an extremely memorable lesson in engineering. Meanwhile, outside the walls, people are already waiting. Farmers with carts of vegetables, eggs, butter, and fresh cheese. A fisherman with baskets from the river. 2 merchants beside heavily loaded mules, hoping to sell cloth, salt, or wine to the household. Everyone understands that the gates will not open simply because they arrived early. Security comes before commerce. Always, one by one, the visitors are assessed. Familiar faces receive a nod. Strangers receive questions. Where are you from? Who are you here to see? What are you carrying? There are no identity documents. Instead, trust is built through reputation over years. A merchant who has supplied this castle for 2 decades is treated very differently from a traveller nobody has seen before. Suspicion is not considered rude, it is considered sensible. Finally, the order is given. Guards grasp the winch handles, and the portcullis rises with a deep metallic rattle that echoes across the courtyard. Other men push against the enormous gates, which swing outward with a long groaning complaint, iron hinges protesting another damp night. For the first time since sunset, the castle opens itself to the world. And immediately the courtyard fills with life. Carts cross the drawbridge. Messengers hurry inside with sealed letters. Stable boys guide wagons toward the storehouses, while guards watch every newcomer with practiced eyes. Now the fortress must be brought back to life, and that means fire. Throughout the night, most of the great hearths have been allowed to die down to embers buried beneath ash. Firewood is valuable, and no sensible steward would burn it warming empty rooms. So the servants rely on yesterday's coals to create today's warmth, and it is a genuine race against the cold. In the kitchens, servants kneel beside the great hearth, brushing away ash until small orange sparks appear. Dry straw goes over the embers, then thin twigs gathered the previous day. Someone bends low and blows gently. Nothing, he blows again. A tiny flame appears, then catches. More kindling, then more, and suddenly the fire takes with a satisfying crackle. Within minutes, thick oak logs are pushed into the blaze. One fire is never enough. Large castles contain dozens of hearths, kitchens, great hall, private chambers, workshops, guardrooms, towers, and every one must be relit. Servants hurry through dark corridors carrying glowing coals in iron braziers, waking fireplaces that slept through the night. It is dangerous work, and everybody knows it. A dropped coal can ignite the rushes covering the floor. A neglected chimney can fill a chamber with smoke. Castles were built largely of stone, but their floors, furniture, roof timbers, tapestries and beams contained enormous quantities of wood. Fire was simultaneously the castle's greatest servant and one of its most reliable enemies, and more than one great fortress in history was gutted not by an army, but by a kitchen. Soon the kitchens become unrecognizable. Cold silence gives way to crackling logs, clanging iron, and heavy cauldrons scraping across stone. Sparks rise into blackened chimneys that have witnessed generations of cooks feeding nobles, soldiers, and servants alike. The smell changes too. First wood smoke, oak and beech. Then bread beginning to bake in enormous ovens heated long before dawn. Porridge simmering in great pots. Bacon over open flame. Onions and herbs releasing aromas that drift steadily along the corridors and up the stairs. If you are sleeping in an upper chamber, this is roughly when you wake. Not because anyone announced breakfast, but because an entire castle has become wonderfully, irreversibly noisy. And within the household, everyone wakes differently, which tells you almost everything about medieval society. In the Lord's chamber, one of the warmest rooms, thanks to a large fireplace and heavy tapestries along the stone walls, thick curtains admit only thin strips of light. A valet enters quietly with heated water in bronze basins. Another servant lays out the day's clothing: linen shirt, woolen hose, finely woven tunic, leather belt, perhaps a fur-lined cloak if winter has settled in. Wealthy nobles owned dozens of garments, and dressing still required assistance. Fastenings were fiddly, layers numerous, and expensive fabric deserved careful handling. There is no rushing. A noble's appearance was a statement of authority, and authority was the family business. In the ladies' chambers, attendants helped brush and braid hair, arrange a gown, and select appropriate jewellery. And contrary to popular imagination, noblewomen were not decorative. They supervised servants, managed household supplies, oversaw textile production, received guests, organised charitable giving, and frequently ran entire estates while their husbands were away campaigning, sometimes for years. In a siege, a lady might find herself commanding the defence, and history records several who did it extremely well. Elsewhere, life is considerably less elegant. The squires have been awake some time already, having discovered that sleeping late is an excellent method of acquiring extra chores. They dress in simple wool and hurry toward the armoury or stables, where knights expect armour polished, horses groomed, and equipment inspected before anyone eats. The stable yard is already busy. Grooms brush horses until their coats shine. Hooves are cleaned carefully, harnesses checked for wear, fresh hay distributed to animals, permanently convinced they have not eaten in weeks. A warhorse represented an enormous investment, often costing more than an ordinary labourer could earn in years. Neglecting one would be like forgetting where you parked something extremely expensive. Except that this particular investment occasionally bites. In the servants' quarters, there is no such thing as a slow morning. Maids carry clean linens. Laundry workers haul heavy baskets. Pages race between chambers delivering messages from officials already planning the day. And the steward has almost certainly been awake since before dawn. If the lord owns the castle, the steward makes it function. He oversees nearly everything. food stores, finances, servants, supplies. Before most people have finished breakfast, he is reviewing reports from scribes and senior servants. How much grain remains? Did the blacksmith receive enough charcoal? How many barrels of ale are left? Has the mill delivered this week's flour? These questions sound tedious. They also determine whether 200 people eat next month. Nearby, scribes unroll parchment across heavy oak tables. Quills scratch steadily, recording rents collected from surrounding villages, expenses for repairs, deliveries from merchants, payments owed to craftsmen. Literacy was a specialised skill, and those who possessed it were genuinely valuable. Knights defended the castle with swords, scribes defended it with bookkeeping, and over a long enough period, the bookkeeping probably mattered more. Now here is why this matters for tonight's subject. Look at how a castle handles worry. It does not deny that bad things happen. It assumes they will. It builds walls, checks chains, counts grain, inspects bowstrings, and appoints one person whose entire job is knowing exactly how much food remains. The castle's answer to anxiety is not optimism, it is inventory. And that, I think, is one of the most quietly useful ideas the medieval world can hand us. Not positive thinking. Not pretending danger away, simply knowing, concretely, where you actually stand, how much you have, what condition it's in, and what would happen if the worst arrived tomorrow. Because a great deal of modern anxiety is not really about danger, it is about not knowing. And not knowing is, quite often, a thing you can fix on a Tuesday afternoon with a piece of paper. The steward understood this 800 years ago. He slept perfectly well, not because nothing could go wrong, but because he had counted the barrels. So let us gather the threads, gently, as the fire burns low. We have spent tonight wandering through muddy fields and smoky cottages, across freezing deserts and along battlements before dawn. We have met villagers who never travelled more than a few miles from their birthplace, merchants who crossed continents, stewards counting barrels of ale by candlelight, and a great many camels with strong opinions about mornings. And we have arrived at a rather unexpected conclusion. Medieval people did not have better lives than you, not remotely. Let us be entirely clear about that before we go any further, because the past is very easy to romanticize from a warm bed with clean water 20 steps away. If someone offered you the chance to trade places tomorrow morning, you would ask one important question first. Do I still get antibiotics? And if the answer were no, the conversation would conclude with remarkable speed. The Middle Ages contained hardships most of us would never willingly accept. Disease with no effective treatment. Famine after consecutive bad harvests. Poor sanitation. Genuine danger in childbirth. Almost no social mobility for the overwhelming majority. A life expectancy shaped brutally by infant mortality. Cold that got into the bones and stayed there from November to March. And yet, hidden underneath all of that difficulty were habits that modern science keeps rediscovering as though they were new. Live close to a community that knows you. Spend time outdoors every single day. Move your body as a matter of ordinary living rather than as a scheduled correction. Follow regular rhythms. Let the day have an ending. Celebrate the good things loudly and while they are actually happening. And accept, genuinely accept, that a great deal of life is simply not within your control. But perhaps the greatest difference of all, the one that sits underneath every other observation we've made tonight, is this. Medieval people rarely expected life to be perfect. They expected it to be unpredictable. And there is an enormous difference between those two positions. It might be the whole difference. Because when you expect life to run smoothly, every disruption becomes evidence that something has gone wrong. The inconvenience is painful, and then the unfairness of the inconvenience is painful, and that second layer is often heavier than the first. Today, a small setback can feel like a personal disaster. The connection is slow. The order is incorrect. The parcel arrives a day late. The meeting overruns, and somehow these tiny frustrations stack on top of one another until your nervous system responds as though you are preparing to defend a fortified position against a besieging army. Meanwhile, a medieval baker would look at your situation with genuine concern before asking, carefully, "And everyone is alive?" Perspective changes a great deal. But, and this matters, perspective is not the same as dismissal. Your problems are real. Modern anxiety is real. Your brain responds to constant deadlines, financial uncertainty, endless notifications, and an unlimited supply of information in ways your ancestors simply never had to experience. Nobody in 1300 had to develop a strategy for managing an inbox. Nobody had to decide how much of the world's suffering they were emotionally capable of reading about before breakfast. Chronic anxiety is exhausting precisely because it never resolves. There is no harvest at the end of it. There is no season in which it stops. And that is the real insight of tonight's journey. It is not that medieval people were tougher, wiser, or more content than you. Most of them would trade with you instantly and gratefully, and would weep with relief on discovering that their children would probably survive. It is that human beings were never designed to live with 1,000 small worries following them through every waking hour. We were built for seasons, for community, for work you can see the end of, for evenings that actually feel like evenings, for conversations uninterrupted by glowing rectangles demanding immediate attention, and, every now and then, for doing absolutely nothing at all without guilt and without describing it as self-care. So what do we take from all this? Not a lifestyle change, not a philosophy, just a handful of small borrowed things. You do not need a thatched cottage. You do not need to surrender your phone or begin keeping chickens, although your neighbours would certainly develop opinions if you did. But consider the medieval habits that cost nothing. Let the day end. Somewhere at some point in the evening, allow the sun to set on your work, even artificially, even arbitrarily. The list will not be finished. The list was never finished, not once in 800 years of human effort. Medieval people did not stop because they were done. They stopped because the light went. Choose your own sunset. Make your comparisons complete. If you find yourself measuring your life against someone else's, remember that you are almost certainly looking at a cathedral without any scaffolding. The medieval villager envied the blacksmith's house and also knew about his shoulder. You are only being shown the house. Convert worry into procedure. This is the caravan lesson, and I think it may be the most practically useful thing we discussed tonight. When something uncertain looms, the mind wants to think about it endlessly in circles. Do something small and physical instead. Check the strap. Count the barrels. Write the list. Make the appointment. Anxiety hates a task. Count your barrels. This is the steward's lesson. A surprising proportion of dread is not about danger, but about not knowing. Look directly at the thing you have been avoiding looking at, the number, the letter, the appointment, and find out where you actually stand. It is almost always less terrible than the version your imagination has been maintaining at considerable expense. Be reachable to a few, not available to all. You were built for a village. Learn your neighbours' names. Be the person who notices when someone hasn't been seen for a few days. That kind of connection is inconvenient and slightly embarrassing, and precisely what your nervous system has been waiting for. Let yourself be bored. Leave one gap unfilled today. The queue. The walk. The 3 minutes before sleep. Your mind will do something useful in that space, and it cannot do it while being entertained. And celebrate things while they are happening. Not later. Not once the project finishes or the situation improves or the year calms down. Medieval people celebrated at harvest because they had personally watched harvests fail, and they were not prepared to postpone joy on the assumption that more would be arriving. That is perhaps the deepest inheritance available from that world. They did not delay their good moments, because they had no confidence that the future would hold them for safekeeping. We have far more security than they ever dreamed of, and we have used a great deal of it to move happiness further away. There is one final image I want to leave you with tonight. Picture a village at dusk, sometime in the 13th century. The work has stopped, because the light has stopped. Smoke rises from a dozen chimneys at roughly the same moment, because everyone eats when everyone eats. Somebody's grandfather is telling a story about a fish that has been growing for 30 years and will be larger still next winter. Children are listening to a tale they already know by heart. A woman is mending something by firelight. Outside, someone is still looking for a pig. Nobody in that room is optimizing anything. Nobody is behind. Nobody is comparing this evening to a better evening happening elsewhere, because there is no elsewhere they can see, and so this evening is simply the evening. The only one available, entirely sufficient, quietly complete. They did not know they had something precious. They would have been baffled to hear it described that way. They wanted what we have, the medicine, the safety, the food that arrives regardless of weather, and they would have been right to want it. But history is not only a story about how far we have come. Sometimes it is a quiet reminder of what we set down along the way, and never quite meant to leave behind. And perhaps the secret to feeling a little less anxious is not waiting inside some revolutionary invention just around the corner. Perhaps it has been sitting patiently for 800 years in the rhythm of a village at dusk, reminding us that a good life has never been measured by how much we managed to do with it, but by how fully we inhabited the ordinary hours in between. So tonight, when you finally set this aside and let the darkness do what darkness has always done, try to let the day be finished. Not completed. Just finished. The work will still be there tomorrow. It always was. Every generation before you left something undone and went to sleep anyway, and the world continued turning without their supervision, exactly as it will continue without yours tonight. Thank you for spending this evening with me. If you made it this far, whether you're wide awake or halfway to sleep, I'd genuinely love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Leave it in the comments. It's one of my favourite things about doing this, seeing how many quiet corners of the planet are awake together. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, a like helps more people find these videos, and subscribing means you'll be here for the next one. And if there's a period of history you'd like to fall asleep inside, a Roman evening, a Viking winter, a Victorian morning, tell me, and I may well build a night around it. Until then, rest well, history lovers. Let the fire burn low. Tomorrow's work can wait until tomorrow. Good night, peace.